Royal Albert Hall, London, September 14th, 1991. 4,000 people were already on their feet before Eric Clapton touched the first string, and the night was running clean. That is, until the lead guitarist's right hand seized without warning in the middle of the third song. Not a stumble, not a missed chord, a complete lock. His fingers refused to move, and his face told the story before anyone on stage could read it. He set the guitar down, stepped back, and in the next 15 seconds, 4,000 people watched a man fold quietly inward and disappear into the wings. The music stopped. Eric Clapton walked to the center microphone. 4,000 pairs of eyes followed him. He looked out at the hall, that Victorian dome absorbing the silence, and said something no performer with 30 years on stage expects to say mid-show. Is there anyone in this building tonight who can actually play guitar? The hall shifted. A few hands went up, brave, uncertain, the kind that say, "I'll try," without saying "I can." Clapton almost smiled. "I appreciate your courage, but I need someone who actually knows what they're doing." Quiet laughter moved through the room. Then it died. The second silence was heavier than the first. 4,000 people looked at each other in the dark. Nobody moved. Nobody answered. Then, in row 22, center section, a man in a plain dark jacket and a brown tweed cap sat completely still. Wire-rimmed glasses, both hands flat on his knees. Nobody in that row had looked at him all evening. Nobody in the building knew who he was. Nobody knew about the small brown tortoiseshell flat pick sitting in his left jacket pocket, or why it was there. But this story didn't start that night. It started 6 weeks earlier, behind the tall iron gates of a walled estate in Henley-on-Thames. On a morning, a single phone call changed everything. Friar Park, Henley-on-Thames, August 3rd, 1991. Behind the iron gates and the high stone walls, inside a Victorian Gothic mansion with 33 rooms and a garden that took 40 minutes to walk end to end, George Harrison had been quiet for a very long time. Not the quiet of a man with nothing to say, the quiet of a man who had decided, carefully and deliberately, that the world had received enough of him. The Beatles had ended 21 years earlier. The lawsuits had taken 3 of those years. The concert for Bangladesh had taken another piece. Dark Horse had stumbled publicly. Somewhere inside all of that, George Harrison had made a private arrangement with fame. He would create on his own terms, appear when he chose, and disappear when he didn't. Friar Park was where he disappeared to. That morning, the phone rang at 9:30. It was Eric Clapton. The two men had known each other since 1966, long enough that neither one wasted time on small talk. Clapton had a run of sold-out dates. Royal Albert Hall, September 14th. He wanted Harrison there. Not on stage, just present. Backstage in the wings, watching. "Come through the back," Clapton said. "Nobody needs to know you're there." Harrison was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll come, but I'm going through the front door." Clapton laughed, the short, dry laugh of a man who knew better than to argue. "Nobody will recognize you, George." Harrison said nothing to that. He set the phone down and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden. He dressed that morning without thinking about it, the way a man dresses when his hands already know the answer. Brown tweed flat cap, the one he wore when he walked the grounds alone. Wire-rimmed glasses he'd started using for reading. A plain dark jacket with no label worth mentioning. Jeans. Brown leather shoes, worn honest at the heel. In the left jacket pocket, without deliberating for a single second, he dropped his brown tortoiseshell medium-gauge flat pick. He had not planned to bring it. He always brought it. He had been carrying one in a left pocket since he was 16 years old in Liverpool, and the habit had long since moved below the level of conscious thought. He drove himself from Friar Park in a 1984 BMW 525, parked in the public lot on Kensington Gore, paid the attendant in cash, walked to the public entrance of the Royal Albert Hall with a folded program tucked under his arm, and joined the queue like every other person there that night. The Royal Albert Hall was built in 1871, and on certain nights it still remembered what it was made for. The Victorian dome above the stage, 135 feet from the floor to the crown, pulled sound upward and returned it changed, warmer, larger than it had left. On September 14, 1991, 8 Marshall JCM 800 stacks lined the back of the stage in 4 pairs, each one producing 100 watts of clean British amplification. At Clapton's left stood a Fender concert combo, his preference when he wanted the edge taken off. His pedal board carried a Dunlop Crybaby wah, a Boss DD3 digital delay, and a Roland CE1 chorus unit, the same chain he had been running for 2 years of touring. Center stage sat a Shure SM58 on a chrome stand adjusted to Clapton's exact height. The stage floor was bare hardwood, worn pale in the spots where the band had stood in soundcheck. George Harrison found row 22 and sat down. He settled the brown tweed cap low on his forehead, set the folded program on his knee, and looked up at the stage. He had not sat in a concert audience in 11 years. The feeling was strange, not unpleasant, but strange, like wearing clothes that used to fit perfectly and finding they still did. At 9 o'clock, the lights dropped. The band walked out. Then Eric Clapton came through the left wing, his 1988 custom shop tobacco sunburst Fender Stratocaster across his shoulder. The guitar Martin built special to his spec after he sold Blackie at auction 3 years earlier. Alnico pickups, maple neck, a guitar that had already logged 40,000 miles of touring and was only beginning to find its voice. 4,000 people came to their feet before he reached the microphone. The first 2 songs ran clean. Clapton moved across the stage the way a man moves in a room he owns, unhurried, certain, every gesture carrying the weight of 3 decades behind it. In row 22, Harrison leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, watching with the focused stillness of a craftsman studying another craftsman's work. He was not watching as a fan. He was watching the way a carpenter watches a man frame a wall, reading the technique, the economy of movement, the decisions being made below the surface of the performance. 2 minutes into the 3rd song, the lead guitarist's right hand went wrong. Not a hesitation, a full seizure lock, carpal tunnel arriving without warning at the worst possible moment. His fingers stopped. His face changed. He looked at his own hand the way a man looks at something that has betrayed him. He set the guitar against the amp stand, 1 step back. Then his knees went, and the stage crew was already moving before he hit the floor. The feedback cut, the music stopped, and 4,000 people, who had been breathing together for 30 minutes, forgot how to breathe at all. Eric Clapton stood at the center microphone and looked out at 4,000 people who had gone very still. He told them the guitarist would be all right. He told them the show wasn't over. Then he asked the question a second time, and this time there was no laughter in it. Is there anyone in this building who can actually play? A man came forward from the 3rd row, brave, willing, the kind of willing that deserves respect. Clapton took the guitar from his own shoulder and handed it across gently. The man played 4 bars. Clapton listened with his full attention, the way a serious man listens when he is trying to find something to work with. Then he thanked him quietly, took the guitar back, and the man returned to his seat. The hall watched in silence. Clapton turned back to the microphone. "I mean it," he said. "Is there anyone here who actually plays?" The second silence that followed was a different creature entirely, heavier, more final. The kind of silence that starts to feel like an answer in itself. In row 22, George Harrison sat with both hands flat on his knees and felt the silence land on him the way silence only lands on people who have something to offer it. The first voice that came was not fear. It was identity. He was George Harrison. He did not raise his hand in crowds. He did not step onto stages he hadn't been invited to headline. He had spent 30 years building walls around his private life, precisely to prevent moments exactly like this one. The moment where the world looked at him and wanted something, and he had to decide whether to give it. The walls were the point. The walls were what made the rest of it survivable. Then, the second voice came. Quieter, older, the one that didn't argue, just stated. He had been 16 years old in Liverpool when he first put a flat pick in his left pocket. He had been 17 when he auditioned for the Quarrymen on the upper deck of a bus, playing raunchy, note for note, until John Lennon decided he was in. He had been 19 at the Cavern Club, 23 at the Paris Olympia, 24 at Shea Stadium in front of 55,000 people. He had stood on stage at Madison Square Garden for Bangladesh. He had sat in a Bombay studio with Ravi Shankar and learned that the guitar was not one instrument, but many, that a man could spend his whole life on it and still find new rooms inside. Every single time he had stepped forward, every single time he had been uncertain, every single time he had stepped forward anyway, he looked down at his hands, both of them flat on his knees in the dark. Those hands had a knowledge that lived below language, below thought, below memory, below the part of a man that listens to boardrooms and headlines and the opinions of people who had never built anything. The muscle memory in those hands was 25 years old, and it had never once been wrong. He reached into his left jacket pocket. The brown tortoiseshell flat pick was there where it always was. He closed his fingers around it. He pushed the brown tweed cap back off his forehead. The old instinct said, pull it down, hide, disappear into the row the way he had been disappearing into rooms for 20 years. He stopped, straightened his spine, pulled the cap all the way off, and set it on the empty seat beside him. George Harrison stood up. He stepped into the aisle. Long, unhurried steps, the walk of a man who had already made the decision and was now simply moving his body to where his hands were needed. The hall lights were aimed at the stage. Nobody in the surrounding rows registered a tall figure moving in the dark. A security guard at the stage steps raised one hand. Harrison leaned in close and said 2 words. The guard's face changed. Not starstruck, something quieter than that, something closer to recognition of a fact. And he stepped aside without another word. Dave Marks, Clapton's road manager, was standing at stage left when he saw the figure come up the steps. He looked at the jacket first, then the hands. The specific way the left hand was already moving, already finding position. The fingers loose and ready, the way a guitarist's fingers go loose when a guitar is near. He had been around musicians long enough to know what that meant. He went pale. He crossed the stage in 6 steps and put his mouth close to Clapton's ear. Clapton was still at the microphone. He heard what Dave said. He turned slowly toward the wings. In the dim light at the edge of the stage, a figure stood waiting, upright, still, unhurried. Clapton looked at him for 1 full second. Then he turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I believe London has answered the question." The stage lights found Harrison as he stepped forward. It was not his face that gave him away first. A woman in the 3rd row saw the hands, the specific way his left hand closed around the neck of the nearest guitar, the thumb placement, the angle of the wrist, the looseness in the fingers that only comes from decades. A guitarist 5 rows back identified the posture a full second before the light reached his face. Then the light reached his face, and the recognition moved through Royal Albert Hall the way weather moves, row by row, unstoppable, gathering force as it went. Whisper, murmur, then a roar that started at the front and rolled all the way to the back wall, all the way to row 22, to the empty seat with the brown tweed cap sitting on it. Harrison adjusted the microphone stand, slightly taller than the man who had last used it. He looked at Clapton. Clapton looked back. 25 years of history passing between them in a single glance. Harrison leaned into the microphone. "Hello, I'm George." Nobody in Royal Albert Hall had heard George Harrison introduce himself that simply since the Cavern Club in 1961. The roar held for a long moment. Then Clapton raised one hand, and the hall pulled itself back to quiet. A roadie brought forward the cherry-red Gibson ES-335 that had been sitting on a stand at stage right, the ailing guitarist's instrument. 2 humbuckers, warm, semi-hollow resonance, the kind of guitar that sounds like it was built specifically for rooms with history in the walls. Harrison took it by the neck, settled the strap, and adjusted it 3 notches longer than where it had been set. His left hand moved to the 5th fret without looking. He played a single open G chord, unmiked, to tune by ear. The note rang out through the hall raw and unprocessed. Wood and wire, nothing between them, and 4,000 people heard it land in the silence, like something they had been waiting for without knowing it. Clapton crossed the stage. He leaned close to Harrison and said something the microphone didn't catch. Harrison's head tilted slightly. He replied with 2 words. Clapton nodded once and stepped back. Nobody heard the exchange. Nobody needed to. The 2 men had played together since 1966, and some conversations live entirely below language. Harrison looked down at the ES-335 for one moment. Then he played the opening notes of Something, his own song, written in 1969, recorded for Abbey Road, the song Frank Sinatra had called the greatest love song of the last 50 years, and then performed publicly while crediting it to Lennon and McCartney, a misattribution that had sat quietly in Harrison's chest for 2 decades, like a splinter too deep to reach. He had never made a scene about it. He was not a man who made scenes. But he had never forgotten it either. The opening notes moved through the hall, and the recognition came before the second bar was finished. It did not come as applause. It came as breath. 4,000 people exhaling at the same moment, the specific exhale of an audience that has just received something it didn't know it needed. Clapton came in underneath on his Stratocaster, finding the space around Harrison's melody the way a man who knows a room well moves through it in the dark. They had played together enough times that the fit between them required no negotiation. For the second song, Clapton called Wonderful Tonight, and Harrison pulled back, playing spare, melodic lines behind Clapton's vocal, never stepping on the song, only serving it. Then, without announcement, Harrison's fingers found the opening of Here Comes the Sun. Clapton heard it, smiled, and came in underneath. 4,000 people sang every word, all the way through, the dome of the Royal Albert Hall carrying the sound up and returning it larger than it had left. When the last chord resolved, the hall held for 7 seconds. 7 full seconds of total silence. Not confusion, not hesitation, but the specific silence of 4,000 people receiving something that had just changed the texture of the evening. Then the room came apart. Clapton walked to the microphone. "I asked if anyone in London could play guitar tonight," he said. "I did not expect the answer to be the man who wrote Something." Behind him, Harrison was adjusting a tuning peg, head down, a small private smile crossing his face, and going. He did not look up. This channel exists for the ones history almost forgot to credit. Subscribe, because what happened in the backstage corridor after the last note is the part that never made the papers. Harrison came down the stage steps the same way he had gone up. Cap pulled low, head down, moving toward the side exit with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been leaving rooms quietly for 30 years. He had the ES-335 in one hand and his jacket collar up against the corridor draft. The applause was still rolling behind him, through the ceiling, muffled now, distant, the way thunder sounds when the storm has already passed over. He didn't turn around. He had come tonight as the audience, and he intended to leave the same way. He didn't make it to the door. The corridor was narrow. Brick walls, a single bare bulb throwing yellow light across the floor. The smell of old wood and amplifier heat coming through the vents from the stage above. A woman was standing against the far wall in a green wool coat, both hands in her pockets. She had come to the Royal Albert Hall that night to see Clapton. She had not known Harrison would be there. She had watched the entire performance from the wings without moving. Patty Boyd. Married to Harrison for 9 years. Married to Clapton for 8. Divorced from Clapton the previous year. The woman who had been, in different seasons, the most important person in both of their private lives. She stood in that corridor and looked at Harrison the way people look at each other when they share more history than language can efficiently carry. Harrison stopped. "You look well, Patty," he said. His voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who had made his peace with complicated things. Patty looked at him for a moment. "You just played something in front of 4,000 people," she said quietly. Harrison said nothing for a beat. Then, "I played it for one person, same as I always did." Behind him, Clapton appeared at the end of the corridor. He looked at the two of them standing there. He put a hand on Harrison's shoulder and didn't say anything at all. The three of them stood in that 10-foot corridor in the yellow light, and what passed between them in that moment belonged entirely to them. But what George Harrison did the following morning set something in motion that would shape the final chapter of his life and produce the most quietly devastating record he ever made. Harrison drove back to Friar Park alone at midnight. He didn't call anyone. He parked in the same spot he always used, walked through the iron gates, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold on the table in front of him. The garden was dark through the window. The house was quiet. He sat there for a long time. At 7 the following morning, he called his son Donnie. "I played last night." Donnie was 17. There was a pause on the line. "I know," he said. "Someone filmed it." Harrison absorbed that quietly. "Was it good?" Another pause. "Dad," Donnie said, "it was something." Harrison laughed, a short, dry, real laugh, and set the phone down. In the weeks that followed, something shifted inside Friar Park. The studio at the back of the estate, which had been largely silent for 2 years, began to run again. Not for an audience, not for a record label. Harrison started recording the way a man starts writing in a private journal. Because the words had finally come back, and it would be a waste not to put them down. What began in those quiet sessions would eventually become Brainwashed, his final album. Completed by Donnie after Harrison's death in November 2001 and released to the world the following year. The last song on that record carried a 12-string guitar line that sounded, to anyone who knew what to listen for, exactly like the opening of something played in an empty room. George Harrison never explained it. He rarely explained anything. He believed that the music said what the man couldn't, and that a life lived with a flat pick in the left pocket was explanation enough. Subscribe, because every week on this channel, we find the stories that almost didn't get told. Which George Harrison song has stayed with you the longest? Drop it in the comments below.